Okay, what is history? Essentially, now folk, history is written records. It's writing. The people who lived at the time wrote. What they wrote is called primary sources. In other words, we have a scholar named Eberhard who lived in Charlemagne's palace, and he wrote about Charlemagne and Charlemagne's exploits. And time again we've proven, yes, this man actually lived in the palace and he actually associated with Charlemagne. Of course, we've known that for about 1,200 years since Charlemagne lived, 1,200 years ago. But he's a primary source, the best primary source we have for Charlemagne. Then afterwards, other historians will come along and they'll critique what the primary sources were. These people who write later are called secondary. Now, primary sources are okay. I mean, they're actually wonderful, but you have a problem with them. A lot of times you find out that what you originally thought was true was not true. Now, even in the folk, just 2 years ago, there was a big massacre that occurred in Connecticut where some man came in and shot up 26 teachers and students, mostly elementary school students. And the rumors that got started, even in today's modern world of instant communication, that, well, his mother had worked here. It turned out she hadn't. Well, he had been there frequently. It turned out he hadn't. He never had. And, just one rumor after another that, when we started unraveling, turned out to not be true. That's one of the fallacies of primary sources. There is another fallacy of primary sources. The paper you write it on, I mean, assume you write on paper, will tend after a while to get old and faded and completely become worthless and after a while become unreadable. Now, one way around that is to write on stone, and that lasts a whole lot longer. Ancient peoples sometimes wrote on animal skins, they wrote on bark, and the first people we'll talk about, the Sumerians, wrote on clay tablets. They do the writing on the clay, then they bake the clay to harden the clay, and store these things up. Now, that's what we're getting to is when you read a Sumerian clay tablet, you're reading a document that's at least 3,000 years old, in some cases maybe older than that was buried like in a time capsule and untouced and unchanged for 3,000 years. Now keep that in mind, because what we have with other sources, for instance, when we read Aristotle, all we have of Aristotle is a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. And who knows how many changes were made from the time the original person wrote about him to the time it gets here. I mean, if you ever play the game of gossip, if I were to start a rumor on this side of the room and say pass it on, by the time it got back over here to this side of the room, the story might be completely changed, or a lot of the details would certainly be changed. But in the case of Sumerians, again, when you're reading their writings, you're reading very, very original work that has not been changed from that time to this. Again, like a time capsule. By the way, time capsule made the news last week. They discovered a time capsule had been buried by Paul Revere and Samuel Adams, and it contained a newspaper from that time period. That, by the way, it was very brown, but still readable. Any of you happen to hear about the incident? One of you. Okay. Well, yeah, they opened it up. More than 200 years old. All right. There are other ways to get. What about people who never learned to write? And there are a lot of ancient people. Well, we can find out about them through archaeology. Archaeology or biological studies. Now about the biological studies. I mean, archaeology, that's where you dig and just find out what survives of what they had. In other words, particularly we find pottery, because after all, the pottery has survived for hundreds of years. Anything they had that was made of wood likely did not survive. Anything they had that was made of paper and cloth, their clothing, did not survive. But their pottery, yeah, it would have survived. So we often take broken pieces of old pottery that they threw out and glue them together and figure out how they fired up their pottery. And and we try to date how advanced the civilization was by studying the pottery. Now, biological. Biological studies often involve this may sound morbid, the task of digging up graves and noticing how these people were buried and trying to figure out what they died of. It tells us whether these people were peaceful or warlike, and I want to say this about war folk. Humanity seems to be addicted to it, and we have not found a solution, but we can tell by oftentimes digging up that, hey, a very high percentage of these people appear to have died violently, indicating they died in some kind of war. Now, more recently, there has been attempts to study humanity, how it's spread by DNA. DNA, hopefully you all know, is involved in heredity, and it explains that how humanity has spread over the globe, and tries to trace the route that it spread. Now, keep at it. I'm going to have more to say about DNA studies in just a few minutes. But anyway, we got our written records, we've got our archaeology, our biological studies, and from this, we go into a city and figure out, which part of an old buried city was the temple. Now, about the old cities, oftentimes they become what you call mounds. The Arabs call them tells. These people, each generation would live in the city. They lived in the city of their ancestors. And when it came time to repair an old house, instead of clearing away let's say the house was beyond repair, instead of clearing away the rubble, they would simply build on top of the house that had been there before. And then the next year would build on top of that. So you have layer on top of layer. In other words, when this building gets old and unusable, we'll probably get in a wrecking crew and bulldozers, and they'll just carry all the rubble away and build another building in its place on the same level that this one's on. But in those days, they would simply, when the building crumbled, they'd just repile another wall. And you might say, well, how did the rest of the area rise up? Well, because they dumped their garbage outside. They just toss their garbage in the streets. So after a while, after years and years of dumping garbage, the street levels would start to rise higher and higher and higher. And eventually, when the city was abandoned, it would be abandoned over several layers. And our archaeologists would dig down. This layer is the Ur 2 layer. And this layer is the Ur 3 layer. And the next layer, that's the Jimdif Nasser layer. And so on this layer is the way down, this proto-dynastic layer. And they dig down to come to the very bottom layer, which they call virgin soil. And that's where it was uninhabited. Then the next layer up, that's where it started to be inhabited. And they try to notice the progression. It looks like in this layer they started using a wheel. In this layer they apparently began to tame cats. They began to tame the dog, and they began to learn to use crops. And they noticed the progression that way. But again, biological studies archaeological studies does have its problems, in that the evidence you find is often contradictory. And these people did engage in trade. Therefore, a lot of times you find a vase that was maybe made 1,000 miles away, located over here, because some woman who liked that vase bought it from a merchant after the vase had traveled 1,000 miles. So, all right. Now, if you read the book the authors will tell you that as far as we know about the very, very earliest part of human history, humans evolved from other primate ancestors. When I was in school, we believed it was the gorilla. Gorilla was man's nearest relative. But somewhere between then and now it became the chimpanzee. And more recently it's become a very close relative of the chimpanzee called the bonobo, B-O-N-O-B-O. I guess that's how you pronounce it. And eventually, man gradually rose himself up, pulled himself up by his own bootstraps, became hunters and food gatherers, and developed primitive ways of living. You have the first human culture, was believed to be the Paleolithic, followed by later by the Neolithic, with in between a Mesolithic. The word Paleolithic means Old Stone Age. Supposedly the stones you find in this period of time are rather crude, then a Middle Stone Age, and then finally a New Stone Age where the stone tools and stone weapons were somewhat better, actually noticeably better, higher quality. The Old Stone Age eventually gave rise to the Bronze Age, and then the Iron Age as man learned how to use metals. Should be a C. And then you have, from studying graves, you have the Neanderthal, Cro-Magnon, and finally the modern man. All right. Now, about the Neanderthal man, what you believe about him, it depends on your worldview, but also what you may have heard about him depends on what you've read and when you read it. He was at first looked on as being a very, very super primitive caveman. At one point they said, if we're studying his bone structure, it's obvious he couldn't even talk. Now we're convinced he could. He's been looked on throughout the time, from the time he was discovered as being a cousin of modern humans and not an ancestor, but a cousin only. But lately, though, we've discovered that he is buried alongside of Homo sapiens. He buried his dead, by the way, and he buried his dead often with flowers and vases and artifacts, indicating religious, that he had some kind of religion. And a lot of persons are now saying that we could recreate a Neanderthal person if we could just find a man who has the most Neanderthal DNA and combine with a woman who has the most, and get them mated up, and then they would combine with someone, and we could eventually create a modern day Neanderthal man, and he would not necessarily be an uncouth caveman. Speaking of cave people, folk, every generation has had its cavemen and women. We have them today, and we have cave people today who own cell phones and iPads. When you see a person living under a bridge who has a color TV set, you can tell, hey, he's part of a society, maybe on the fringe, but it's advanced. What am I getting at? We find paintings in France with high quality oil paints, and the artwork is high quality artwork, indicating that whoever painted them lived on the fringe of a more advanced society.
Question.
Yes.
I'm everywhere.
What's that?
I got a few questions.
Go ahead.
You said, so do we have homework in this class?
Yes. 2 papers to grade and getting ready for the test.
Okay.
That's all. As far as a daily assignment, no.
All right. So then we don't have study guides, and we don't have
The homework is to read the chapters.
Okay.
And that's on the syllabus.
See, I feel like it was like a big blank. I didn't know where we was at. I feel like we just hopped in. I don't know. Eventually.
Yeah, but if you want me to make study groups and then you'll go.
But that's what he said. I didn't know.
Like,
he said it.
I'm saying that.
On your own terms.
Like, we should make a group of people so it'll make it easier to follow the instructions.
Okay. Because I'm everywhere.
Hey, if you read the chapter, that'll keep you busy. Preparing for the test, that'll keep you busy. All right. Anything else? Anyway, now something else about these 2 men. By the way, about the Cro-Magnon man, it is now known that he is, in fact, the ancestor of modern Europeans. Now, some years ago, I did a study of my own personal DNA, and I have haplogroup R1b, which was carried by the Cro-Magnon man. So whatever the Cro-Magnon man was, he's an ancestor of mine. We can't quite prove that the Neanderthal man is an ancestor of these other 2 yet. Personally, though, I strongly suspect that he was. Now, the other thing I want to mention about these men, they averaged in height 6 foot tall. and modern man does not average that tall. And he had a noticeably larger skull capacity than modern man, both of them, both the Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon man, indicating possibly that he actually had more intelligence than modern humans. And even the zoology book I have at my house that I've had since 1967, by the way, the authors wondered if modern humans are not degenerate. Again, study the fossil record.
Yeah, how are they so small now? If they
How come
were
humans are so
6
small?
feet, why wouldn't they still average 6 feet? That's not.
Okay. All right. Okay. First of all, I'm going to make one other point. Right here in the state of Georgia, there were giant sloths that were as big as elephants that roamed the state of Georgia at one time. This can prove the buffalo once got bigger than a modern elephant, but somehow over time it got smaller. What happens to a species is we all eventually develop and pass on mutations or recessive genes that we get that are not as, that means that our descendants will generally not be as good as we were. We pass on these recessive mutations, and it guarantees that species will decline over time, which is contrary to what you've been told, that evolution guarantees that species will rise over time. But actually, over time, all species that we observe tend to decline, including modern humans. Now, you might can tell I'm of European descent. If you look at the armor that European knights wore 12, 13, 14, 1500 years ago, it indicates that the height of the average human male 1,000 years ago was only about 4'6". Well, what happened that makes us modern men so big? Okay, here's my theory on it. It's not better diet. It's not better health care. It's that a bunch of Europeans moved to America and they began marrying strangers, persons who they were not related to. The more distant in other words, by strange, I mean we marry people who we never knew growing up and none of our kith and kin are associated with. We're not marrying our relatives. In Europe, they were living in the same village, and even though they didn't marry their sisters, they were marrying persons who had lived in that village for hundreds of years, I mean their ancestors. So they might as well have been marrying their first cousin or even closer. After a while, and that led to them declining, and living shorter and shorter lives. Then, a bunch of them came here, and the Scots person would marry the Welsh, and the French would marry the Swede. A lot of Swedish people came over, and the Americans started getting bigger and bigger. But the tendency is to decline, and that's what we see in the case of Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon man. They were apparently bigger. Now, speaking of decline, is there any evidence? I was asked one time, do you have any hard evidence that, all right, how hard, I asked this person, is the Great Pyramid? The question I want to ask you, and some of you might have heard is, could we, with our modern technology, build the Great Pyramid today?
I think we could. Why not?
What's that?
I think we could. Why wouldn't we be able to?
Our machinery cannot pick up stones that are that heavy.
No way.
Okay, you don't believe it. All right. But even your authors, folk, as conservative they are, when they come to discussing the Nazca lines in South America that are miles and miles long, so even they say that it's led some people to wonder if somebody was not observing from space and radioing down to instruct them, hey, build the road here and go this direction, no, veer a little bit to your right, veer a little bit to your right. If somebody was not instructing them, because we don't know how they could have built that kind of straight lines without the aid of some kind of. And then you have another case at Costco, and where that you have stones that were obviously quarried down at sea level, and all of a sudden the cliff rocks here 13,000 feet, and this building is 13,000 feet into the air. And folk, you can't go from sea level to 13,000 feet without taking a long time to do it. How did they raise the stones? And folk, we know we can't do that.
They worked as a team.
There's no trail as to how they could have carried them upward. In other words, the cliff goes straight up. Okay, they worked as a team. It's good. All right, that's standard view.
But there's also that old world map, like ages ago, like the crazy map of like the world how would you have drawn that without being able to see it from space?
You've read some of this stuff. Excellent. There is a map, several old maps that show the continent of Antarctica, and Antarctica is split in two, that show North and South America, located in a proper location, that show the Amazon River, that was written long before Columbus, printed up long before Columbus. Some people believe the Chinese had mapped the world, but basically we don't know how these things are about. In other words, the point I'm making, folks, if I can, is these people were not primitive cavemen. From the very beginning, they had advanced civilization, as I'm about to try to show. Where did they get their civilization from? I'll tell you in a few minutes what they said about the subject. But before, National Geographic is doing some extensive DNA studies, folk. And back, about 7 or 8 years ago, I participated. And now they've got even more detailed studies that can supposedly link you up with anyone rich or famous, or if you're linked to royalty. And for $100, you can have your DNA studied to determine. Anyway, here's what I got from them. Now, let me hasten to state, National Geographic is not a Christian organization. And they're dedicated to proving evolution. But nevertheless, this is a study they did, and they're trying to trace, they say before mankind gets so scattered, they're trying to trace human steps. And they're tracing through both the male and female line. Now you may know that if you're male, you inherit Y chromosome DNA from father to grandfather, great-grandfather, and on down. Female, it's called mitochondrial DNA that you inherit from your mother and her mother. What I have here would not apply to my sisters, because even though we have the same mother, they would not get their DNA from the same sample from their dad, the same way I would. But back in 1986, we made a very super interesting discovery. We discovered that all human females alive today, maybe not all who ever lived, but all human females alive today are descended from one woman. Have any of you heard this from any other source, by the way?
Bible?
You haven't? Okay, yeah, we're all descended from one woman. I mean, it's right here, folk. And does anyone dare venture a guess what they call the woman? No, it's not Lucy. The name you're probably familiar with, it comes from a book that's not allowed in our public schools. Eve. Eve. They call her Eve. Then they discovered that all human males alive today were descended from the same man. You can guess. The name also comes from the same, I'm going to call it the Forbidden Book. The same man, from one man. They called him Adam. All right. They have Adam and Eve originating in Africa. I mean, right here it is, folks. Right here it is. You're welcome to come and have a closer look. I mean, Eve is originating from right here in the Kenya region of Africa. When we come to Africa, we'll talk more about this. So they say this is where humanity originated and spread out over the globe. And they do have, however, Eve, according to them, would have lived much, much earlier than Adam. Well, you might say, how can that be? The original Eve, of course, had a husband, no doubt, had descendants. But most of you probably have heard of a story about a disaster that wiped out all of humanity except for one man and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives. It's called the flood story, which would explain, folk, why that the Adam that all males were descended from would have lived sooner than the original Eve. Now, of course, they have a different explanation. They say, well, it's that in time past, women would be married out of a tribe, and the men would stay in their tribe. I don't really see that as an adequate explanation. What I'm getting at, folks, is the flood story, in addition to being told by every race of humanity all over the globe. The American Indians, every tribe we know of, had a flood story. The Egyptians, Babylonians. It's also written in our DNA. Eve's descendants, they have her first move, going up here in the region of Mount Ararat and overspreading the whole globe from the region of Mount Ararat. Who knows what's so significant about Mount Ararat?
Is that where the boat landed?
It's where the boat landed.
But if National Geographic isn't a Bible-based,
It is
people-
far from a
but
Bible-based.
how are they confirming that everyone originated from Adam and Eve?
By doing DNA, studying human DNA.
So
All right,
that's
essentially,
proving that the
they're studying the mutations. In other words, we have mutations that come along, we pass down to our descendants. That's how we can tell, for instance, Thomas Jefferson, so that Sally Hemings' known descendants carry Thomas Jefferson's DNA. Sally Heming was a slave girl, by the way. Some of you may have heard the story. Now, of course, somebody said, oh, but at least 5 men living in that area had Thomas Jefferson's DNA, which is probably true enough. But they proved, for instance, so we're solving crime cases by DNA studies, that each person has some unique DNA, but also your family has unique DNA. So they have, for instance, my DNA has the R1b haplotype. There's the M39, M172, M1201. And they trace that this M201 is found here, and then it goes to here, and then it's found over here, indicating that people who carry this DNA migrated. It was basically, in no way are they trying to prove the Bible, but they wind up, the point is proving at least part of it without them intending to, without them meaning to, without them even wanting to, in fact. Or at least making it easy for us, for some of us who want to believe. Now, folk, I'm aware this is a state school. And what I'm saying is offensive. I just have an open mind, like I was asked to do when I was younger, dealing with professors who did not believe as I believe. Again, you can make up your minds what you believe about any of this as you want to. As for the male group, they seem to congregate from Africa to this region of Babylon. Again, folks, the Tower of Babel story, where mankind was forced to scatter. Now, speaking of the Tower of Babel, I had a student just this time last year say, hey, you shouldn't do the Tower of Babel is not history. Again, it's written in the ancient records, and not just the Bible, it's written in the Sumerian records. If you want me to, I can bring you a copy. But there's something else that... Now, this is not a hard question, folk. When you see this, how do you pronounce it?
Pounds?
Pounds. This is pronounced pounds. It's not spelled the way it's pronounced. Now, the entire Sumerian language was written just like this. That word I put up there actually comes from a Latin word, libre. But in the case of Sumerians, scholars guess, well, they copied their language from another language. The question is, we don't know what language they copied from. And it looks to me like they didn't even know. It's like all the signs and all the writings they had were still intact. And they could still read them, but they would not pronounce them the way they originally pronounced them. Which is exactly, if the Tower of Babel story were true, folks, this is what we would find. And I said, how do we know? Well, I want to tell you about the Sumerian tablets. We have more Sumerian records than we have about Greece and Rome and Persia and Assyria combined. And among them we have dictionaries and lexicons that show pronunciations. And we actually believe if we were alive, if we could go back in time, some of the scholars believe they could actually talk to Sumerians. The Sumerians, they practically sang their language to each other. It was tonal. But their language did not match, the spoken word did not match their written language, from what we know of their pronunciations. They had borrowed it from another language, and apparently they didn't even seem to know what. Okay. So much for that for the time being. Again, I'm tempted to spend another $100 sometime soon and get more detailed DNA that could show if I'm linked up in any way to some rich king back there. There was a noble line in Cunningham a noble line in Scotland named Cunningham. And could I link up with them somehow? Not that I care, but yeah, there's a Cunningham County in Scotland. All right. Which brings us up to, all right, well, something else I must show you. And folks, this is an original source, artwork. Right here. And another one of our books even had more detail. Here is a picture of Egyptian art. It shows human beings. All right. Some of them are very black, some of them are red, and some of them are almost white. What am I getting at? At that time, it wasn't they were different races, folk. At that time, a woman would wonder when as her baby, I wonder if this will turn out red. Over time, we humans have tended to lose the ability to where white couples generally only produce white babies and black couples only produce black babies. But in those days, they still had enough genetic diversity among the couples that a couple might produce one baby that was red and one that was black and one that was almost white. Over time, we lost this ability. There was genetic information disappeared among certain groups of people. Now, the word race, I don't want to use the word race. There's only one race, the human race. But we have to face there are ethnic groups. But it appears, folk, from the studies that at one time, each human being carried more genetic information than we do today. But after a while, humans got scattered. The ones up here only produced white children. After a while, the ones down here only produced black children. Persons who were white found this climate more suitable to them. Persons who were black didn't like this climate. So the black people preferred this climate, and the white people did not like this. In fact, a lot of times, until recently, white people couldn't even live in this climate down here. So after a while, your black couples lost their ability to produce white babies. But there have been 50-some cases of identical twins born. One of them's white, one of them's black. This still happens. Identical otherwise. And maybe I shouldn't say that, but it's twins produced from the same parents. One of them's white, one of them black. Have you ever heard any of this from another source? One of it. This happened not too long ago, about 4 or 5 years ago. A couple had a set of twins. One of them white, one of them black. All right. Again, folk, this is in your book. All right. Now, again, according to standard history, the first humans had to learn how to gather their food. They at first were hunters, and they dressed in skins and could only talk to each other using signs and symbols, and gradually they developed speech over long periods of time. Then they learned how to plant and harvest crops. They learned how to tame certain animals, and they tamed the sheep, the goat, the cow, the pig, and eventually the dog, the cat, the horse, the donkey, and developed over time what we call civilization. Now this word civilization, when I was in elementary school, the teacher asked that, and I put down, oh, it means the ability to write. That's only a small part. The word civilization has the root word of civil. It means when people get together and organize themselves into community. They have a head, usually called a king or a governor, and he has deputies, nobility, and the king has an army, but you have specialization. In other words, over here might be a blacksmith, and next door to him would be a tanner, and next to him would be a soldier. 90% of the people in those days, until recently, had to be farmers. With the development of the tractor and the combine and the reaper, we have a much smaller and smaller percentage of people being farmers. But at one time, it took 90% of the people being farmers to support the other 10%. But civilization means you have scribes, in other words, scholars, people who keep records, differentiation of abilities. You have money, trade. All this is part of it. Civilization has supposedly occurred over time, long and gradual, but there are persons who say it occurred suddenly, bang, all of a sudden it was there. The Sumerians said a fish man swam up the Persian Gulf and gave them the arts of civilization. I'm going to have more to say about that in a few minutes, folks. Again, you can decide what you believe. The first civilization we know of is the Sumerians. The Sumerians lived on the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates River in a region we call Mesopotamia. This word Meso again means middle. Mesopotamia means the land between the rivers. The two rivers being the Tigris and the Euphrates. Two rivers. This was part of a region called the Fertile Crescent. By the way, your book does have a map of the way that humans spread out population. It's very, very similar to the one I just showed you right here. A map showing humanity spreading over the globe, fanning out from its original starting place in Africa, going from there to the Middle East, and from the Middle East spreading out over the globe. And it shows a picture of the cave paintings also on page 5. They call it Paleolithic old-time cave painting. But anyway, this region is part of the Fertile Crescent, and again, Fertile Crescent is crescent-shaped. It's a fertile area on this part of the globe right here, Mesopotamia, and includes what is today Israel, Palestine. The reason it's called a Fertile Crescent is most of this area around here is very difficult to work and farm, but this area is quite fertile. Arabia, of course, one big, mostly desert. This region where civilization supposedly began, and again, you must notice I say supposedly because some of this is still fairly well speculative. They set up kings, and they developed writing. They tamed the cat, the dog, the pig, the sheep. And folks, I can't imagine how the sheep ever were tamed, because the fact is sheep cannot survive without humankind. If you go around the corner of a barn, they can't even find your way unless they wave to you, unless they follow you. They can't even find their own pastures, their own water. The shepherd has to lead them to water. They can't fight off their enemies either. But nevertheless, the stand here, at one time the sheep was wild, and then eventually along came humans and found some and domesticated them. I can't imagine sheep having been anything else but domesticated in the beginning, but there are problems with any stance you take. Now, the Sumerians wrote in a script that we call cuneiform. And your book shows some rudimentary elements of how it developed. A cuneiform script developed over time. I once thought, folk, I'd like to learn the cuneiform language, but then I got busy with all the stuff that young people have to do. But I learned a few cuneiform symbols. The wedge-shaped characters, folk, they're shaped somewhat like this. And you might wonder, what's so great about that shape? Simply this. They learn how to write by taking a little what you call a stele and pounding on a clay. In other words, they want the symbol to go this way, they pound this way, then turn their hand at right angle, bang, bang, and they just simply write bang, 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 bang. Just by turning your hand at right angles, and eventually all the symbols either went this way or down. Never backwards. Now, at first they went backwards, but there were a few that went at angles, but for the most part it was at right angles, just straight across or down. And they could do it just by stamping a wedge, sometimes called a stele, and just stamp here and it's up. I mean, it's straight across, stamp here. Whoops. And it's down. And this was the way they did their writing. Now, okay, now becomes the real problem with the Sumerians. It's sometimes called the Sumerian problem. Where'd they come from? And folk, I did one of my first graduate papers was on this issue. Where did the Sumerians come from? We simply don't know. Their language does not tell us that, by the way, their language is unrelated to any language on earth. It's in the past by itself. You have to wonder, how can that be? I mean, no kin to any other language. And hey, English and German are kin to each other. Latin and French and Spanish are kin languages. But a language is all by itself, and again. But, now here's though the real problem with the Sumerians. What they wrote, we today would tend to call fairy tales. You probably had fairy tales read to you, may have read fairies, perhaps even still enjoy reading them. A fairy tale can have three types of beginnings, folk. It can begin with once upon a time, long ago and far away. Those two, then there's a third beginning, back when I was in the army. And what follows is often fairy tale of sorts. And they have another ending. Who knows how fairy tales usually end? And they lived happily ever after. I saw a cartoon of a man reading a book of fairy tales to his daughter. Old man, and he was reading, and they lived happily ever after on Social Security. The reason I can afford to teach here is I'm getting Social Security off. No, I'm not going to hesitate to tell you. I'll be 66 in June. 65. So, anyway, now, what's about we call fairy tales? Essentially, these people believed without any hesitation that their gods were maintaining a physical, actual, flesh and blood presence in their temples, eating food, demanding sacrifices, and even cohabiting with earth women and producing hybrid offspring that were part God and part man. These stories, and they produced a race of giants. These stories are found all over the globe. I mean, in Greece, everyone knows this, I think. Who was Hercules' father? Zeus. Gilgamesh. 2/3 God and 1/3 his father is believed to be fully God, and his mother about 3/8 God. Put the math together and you find a man who's 2/3 God and 1/3 human. Yes, Gilgamesh is mentioned in your book. Folk, I can't prove that those gods actually did exist and live in the Sumerian temples. But I can prove to you that the ancients actually believed that they did without any shadow of a doubt, without any hesitation. Stories, every race of people, pardon that word race, every ethnic group of people believe that they begin their history with stories that we today would call myths or fairy tale. Myths are stories about gods. Then came the period of the legends, which we call stories about demigods or half gods and half human. Gods, legends. Now, folk, why am I saying this? I feel like you have to understand these people. Now, we discuss at faculty meetings, are these courses about us or are they about you? But I have a different take. It's neither about me, certainly not about me, and it's not even about you. It is about them. To really understand it, you have to understand their mind, and it was not like our mind. They did not know the difference, folk, between science and religion. We call the Egyptian scribes priests, but in the Egyptians' mind, they might have been priests also, but they also were scientists. Show them one of these, and they would think that this is a mystical device. That in the modern world, we have a whole lot of magic. We light up our rooms with magic. We travel about with magical devices. We fly on magical devices. No, we actually don't. But they would not know the difference between magic and science. They never had a conflict between science and theology, and today we do have. They didn't. Because to them, science and theology was all one and the same. The sun was God. The river was God. When the river rose, they didn't think that it was because there's a rainstorm way up the river that caused the river to rise. The river rose because the river, was angry. Now granted, if any of you go outside and find your car doesn't start, and you start performing some ceremony, maybe offering a sacrifice to try to get your car running again, they would probably take you to some psychiatrist to find out what's wrong with you. But in those days, this was a way they got their gadgets to work as best they could. They believed that if they performed the right sacrifices, they could get the God's favor once again. In other words, the car doesn't start because the gods are showing some disfavor. That spirit in your car disfavors you, so you have to win the favor back. Now again, folks, this is not what I actually believe. This is what they believed. Now, on page 12 is a very, very famous quote. Again, I know most of you don't have the book, but it's this quote about the city of Ur. I'm going to read it to you. Ur is destroyed. Bitter is its lament. The country's blood now fills its holes like hot bronze would fill a mold. Bodies dissolve like fat dissolves in the sun. Our temple is destroyed. Our gods have abandoned us like migrating birds. Smoke rises on the city like a shroud. Now, the smoke was rising somewhat in a mushroom shape. I mean, that's the word, that's the connotation we get. What kind of destruction is this person talking about?
Perhaps a nuclear.
Nuclear destruction. He's describing it to a T, folk.
The Indian religion has crazy stuff like that too. Like,
All the ancients believed in stuff like this.
but it's like crazy stuff, like floating cities to like blast lasers and stuff like that. Star Wars is based on half of that. It's crazy.
The Vedas, we're going to talk about when we come to the chapter on India. The Vedas talk about spacecraft, leaving Earth in spacecraft. But back to this. There's something else. They believe their gods not only maintain a physical presence, but they believe their gods have the power to fly. Basically reminds you of the story of Superman from the planet Krypton. But when the going got really tough, those gods took off and flew away and would not stay and help them. Because the gods were just as fearful of destruction as were the humans. But the gods were able to fly off. I mean, you might think, oh, they were speaking poetically. Now, again, if you look this up on the web, folk, and I have, they'll say this is a poem, or this is just a lament, and they were prone to exaggerate. It was not exactly real. But, folk, what I just read to you is an original source, penned at the time supposed it happened. All right, something else. This city of Ur, a very famous person came from there. Anybody know who I'm talking about? And this being a Jewish community, somebody ought to know. Ur. Who came from Ur? Abraham, the ancestor of Jewish people. At least one Jewish scholar believes that Abraham was told to get out of the city just before the destruction hit, and the destruction hit right after Abraham left. And the Jewish people today are the only known surviving descendants of the Sumerians. Without being disrespectful, I mean, my wife, I'll tell you, my wife is Jewish herself. Without being disrespectful to you, I will state that I believe the Jews are the only living descendants. That Abraham was a Sumerian, and Jews are the only living descendants of the Sumerians. The Sumerians were forgotten about for some 1,000 or so years, actually more than 2,000 years were forgotten about. Then about 200 years ago, we started finding writings that indicated, hey, here was a group of people, and we got to look at these are the people who, hey, they invented a wheel, they invented writing, they domesticated the sheep, the goat, the cow, the pig, the horse. I mean, these were some of the most creative, inventive people that ever lived. And how come they got completely gone and forgotten about? 2,000 years, again, that's something for us to wonder about. But eventually the memory was discovered. They also are believed to have invented or created all the religious systems that man has followed from that day till this. They're gods. I've mentioned about the gods. For instance, start with Anu. Oops. The Romans knew him as The Romans knew him as Uranus. Oops, U-R-A-N-U. See that Anu there? A-N-U? Yeah, Anu, Uranus, Marduk. The Romans knew him as Mars. Some people believe that these religions are all started by one woman, and this woman goes by many names, but among the names, the one you all should be familiar with, Isis. And that name is making news big time in the modern world, and has been unknown to most of us down through the ages. Isis, Semiramis, Venus, Aphrodite, Frigga, Inanna, that she might have been the one who started all these, got all these various religions going. The religion was polytheistic, as opposed, and it would polytheistic mean worship of many gods, as opposed to monotheistic, the worship of one God. All right. Now, folk, if you think you've heard some strange things, let me tell you that the more you study it, the stranger it gets. These people had some beliefs that we would call weird, and yet these people appear to have been fully rational, deep-thinking human beings who were highly advanced. They were not primitive in their mindset, primitive in their way of thinking. You can tell a person's intelligence spoke by his writing all the time. They had it. They were very intelligent. And this shows up in their writings. And yet they believed things that we today would class as being primitive, simplistic. Either what they said was true, or else they had super vivid imaginations. I'll leave you with that. Any questions? No, we don't have time. Come back Wednesday for more.